Hi again. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about mapping and talk a little bit more detail about configurations. So actually for this tutorial I'm going to load one of our work in progress layouts because it will allow me to talk about button mapping as well, which is another interesting feature in ScopeSync. So if I go across to the configuration manager, and here I can load a different layout but for the same configuration. So if I scroll down here I'm going to pick the BCF 2000 layout. So I'll come back out here. You can see this is a layout that maps up to the standard BCF 2000 from Behringer. So the first thing you'll notice is the fact that it's actually retained the two parameters that we'd set up previously. So obviously with different look and feel, but these have all the same settings. I can go and edit those and you'll see that there's no difference in there. I've also got in this particular layout some buttons, and I'll be able to demonstrate some mapping using buttons in this tutorial. So to start with, I'm going to set these two buttons here to be able to move up and down through the discrete parameters that I've set up here. So basically to move between the between the 6 different waves for the multimode oscillator. So if I right click on this and edit the mapping, I can map that to the same parameter that I'd already set up. So that's parameter 2, which is currently described as cutoff frequency confusingly, so probably worth me going in and changing that. I'll do that shortly. So the mapping type, now this determines how the button interacts with that particular parameter. So we've got choices of no toggle, toggle, increment, decrement, and then wraparounds for each of those. So no toggle, that means that when I click on the button, it sends the parameter that I've mapped to. Toggle means it toggles between two different values for that parameter. Increment and decrement is fairly obvious. It moves up and down through the settings. When it reaches the bottom reaches the top for increment, it stops, and when it reaches the bottom of decrement, it stops. And these two wrap around. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set these to have so the top one to be increment with a wraparound, and I've also got the radio group. Now this is not relevant for the type of solution we're putting in place here, but essentially that allows us to have radio group mapped buttons. So now you'll see that this is mapped to the same parameter, and I can then increment that value. Now because we're wrapping it around, I can just keep clicking on it and it moves around the values. What I want to do now is set the item below. Actually, I'm going to quickly change the name of that to save confusion. So So it's now set to oscillator type, a bit more sensible. So I'm going to edit the mapping for the button below, choose oscillator type, mapping type of decrement wraparound, again leave the radio group blank, and now I can move up and down through these settings. So you'll notice that in the 3 places the same value is being displayed. One interesting feature to mention here is I can actually type into these. So if I type triangle, it'll actually move the value accordingly. So I've got the ability to, from 3 different places, set that value. This can be quite handy if you're actually mapping to a hardware controller externally. So the next thing I want to describe in a bit more detail is how to work with these mappings in the configuration manager. So if I move across here, I'll talk a little bit through what's going on in this tree and how to navigate it. So at the top level, we can get back to the settings, so that's where I chose the replacement layout. And then under here are the top level items, so I'll just shrink these down quickly so I can talk through them. So the first set of the host parameters, these are the ones that pass between scope and the DAW. So for each of these you'd set a ScopeSync code, so I'm going to set that one to A1, and that means that the data is sent between the DAW and scope via ScopeSync on channel A1. And I can set all of the same settings I was accessing from the right-click menu within here. One of the things you can do in here that you can't do on the right-click menu is reorder these parameters. So if I drag that up there, you'll see parameter 2 is now above parameter 1. And the reason for that is to allow you to control the order they appear in the DAW. Scope parameters are the parameters that only are controllable from within scope. So these don't get sent across the ScopeSync link, and they're typically for built-in features. So control panel to host, open patch window, and open preset window are features of the header bar, and they're not relevant to pass across the ScopeSync link. So they have their own series of codes, and those are passed across into the pipe outputs from the SS128A, and some of them are hard coded within the module itself. So I'm going to talk through those. Now I'm going to have a look at what mappings have been created for the parameters I've already set up. So first of all, we set up some sliders. Those sliders in here were just mapped between the slider name. So first one was S1 and the second one was S2. Close this down a bit. So if I want to map a different slider in here, I can choose that. So if I wanted to map S2 to parameter 1, I can do that. I can add new mappings in here. So again, I can choose to map S3 to that same value if I want to. So if I close that now, you'll see that that one's tied into the same. I can also, from this, I can delete that parameter, but in this case, if I delete the parameter, it's actually going to delete it in all places. So if I undo that, so using Control Z, I can either use Control Z, or from the bottom, from the toolbar here, I can just click on the undo and redo buttons. So go back into this window here. I'm just going to delete that new mapping I've created, and let's look at the text button mappings. So there's some default mappings that we're using for the header bar, and then my new ones I've just created are mapping these specific buttons. So B34 and B42, obviously that's why it's easier to map them from the right click menu, because you don't have to remember which ones are which, and that's telling me what exactly is happening with this mapping. So I could also, we can make some changes here. So I'm going to change these to be just straight increment and decrement items in here, and close that. So now if I move to the top, then it stops. If I move to the bottom, it stops. So that's essentially the mapping section. Now I've got, you'll notice, labels, combo boxes and tabbed components. So depending on how the layout's been set up for you, some of these may actually map to useful things. Depending again on how things have been set up, some of them might also map. So if we look at this example here, actually there's a label here which is showing the short text. There's a label here that's showing the ScopeSync code. These are automatically tied in as a unit within the layout to the same mapping. So when I map the slider, or if I actually map this label here, so you see label L2 or label LS2, those automatically map each of the other components into the same place. So that saves you clicking multiple times. So you won't see those in here, that's handled automatically via the layout. And then the final item, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'll come on to in the next tutorial, is style overrides. And that's how you can change the look and feel of particular components to your own needs for grouping parameters or identifying specific ones using a different color or a different knob layout. So, okay, well, thanks very much for listening, and hope you look forward to the next tutorial about style overrides.